Willie Nelson, who is 91 years old, is a living legend who has endured storms that most people wouldn't endure, such as court cases, divorces, and sold-outs. He has lived a life beyond most people's expectations, filled with arenas and classic songs. But Chris's name reverberates across the pages of his narrative, through all the highs and lows. Kristofferson's connection went beyond music. It was one of defiance, commitment, and there were moments of calm tension when they were just like-minded people in a changing sector. Or was there a deeper feud, split, or wound that was left behind? Unspoken, these two legends helped demolish the polished image of country music as it developed walls and replaced them with something unpolished and authentic. This is the tale of two men who didn't merely follow their own rules, instead changed them. And fundamentally of it all is the reality of one of the most intricate friendships in music. Nashville in the 1960s was more than just a city. It was a system with laws, a dress code, and to succeed in country music, you needed more than simply a sound and a formula. Songs had to be about heartbreak, and you had to be talented to fit the template. Artists were expected to be polished for Saturday night drinking or town pride. The outfits weren't simply clothes. They were uniforms, and they were camera-ready and spotless. The radio gatekeepers in Grand Ole Opry were in charge of the show, and anyone who didn't play according to their script, it was soon shown that two guys entered this world. Didn't just disregard the rules, they pretended to comprehend them. Willie Nelson was a quiet Texan who had a talent for penning songs that could shatter glass when he arrived in Nashville. He was penning songs for the greatest names in the industry, such as Farron Young's Hello Walls and Patty Clean's Crazy, but the doors remained closed while he performed his own tunes since his voice was too honest, his wording too odd, and his manner too genuine for Nashville. He wore suits because they didn't know what to do with someone who wouldn't be smoothed out at the time. Instructed him to cut his hair back since they thought it looked better that way. But he was destroying the man who wrote some of country music's most recognizable songs, was unable to convince anyone that he was a legitimate artist in his own right. Thus, despite coming from an entirely different background, Kristofferson was a Rhodes Scholar and Army captain with a similar mentality. A golden lad who turned down a job that offered security and status. He gave everything up for a mop and a job as a janitor at Columbia Records so that he might be close to the music that people believed he was insane. And perhaps he was. But Kristofferson's song didn't. His words weren't just about heartbreak. They sounded like anything else on the radio. They discussed the agonizing burden of being human as Sunday morning approached. Was a man's soul attempting to make sense? It wasn't a drinking song. Both men were misfits and outliers to the Nashville elite because of his personal disaster. Chris was too obstinate to control Willie, and he was too intellectual. None of them performed the role, but they both continued to write, continued to knock on doors, while in the background, they were beginning to construct something that would shock. The fundamental element of country music that made them deadly wasn't there while the rest of Nashville followed scripts. These two were living their lives in disobedience because it was their authenticity. Their songs in real time, telling the truth rather than trying to sell a picture. Truth. Willie's songs were heartbreaking, accompanied by delicate, lovely melodies. The songs of Haunting Chris were bare-hearted, regret-filled short stories. The industry was unprepared to deal with the loss of war, love, and terrible honesty. However, the audience was prepared. This was the start of something. A silent storm was building that was larger than any of them could have predicted. In radio booths or boardrooms, but in smoky taverns and roadside honky-tonks. Yet among those weary of the glitzy falsehoods, Nashville was unaware of what was about to happen. And two individuals who refused to be anything other than themselves, Willie Nelson, Chris, were at the heart of that impending maelstrom. Outlaws and soon-to-be revolutionaries are Kristofferson's misfits. Sometimes the noise can be broken by a single act of insanity. Despite having degrees and decorations from his time as a military, Kris Kristofferson exchanged all of things to pursue a less specific musical genre. And when the doors of he kicked one down literally in a second when the industry refused to open for him. Kris, a legend in country music, took control of a National Guard helicopter and dropped it on Johnny Cash's doorstep. Yard only to give him a sample tape. Although it seems like a scene from a movie, it really genuine, a last-ditch effort motivated by his belief in his music and his displeasure with when the recording arrived Sunday morning, Johnny Cash listened to it. He performed it on national television, felt it in his bones, and Kristofferson, the rebel, was on everyone's lips practically immediately. Willie Nelson had been silently sinking while Kris was soaring when the poet had arrived. Willie was choking while being bound to the Nashville formula, and they continued to clothe him. He would arrive in the studio with soulful tunes, dressed like someone he wasn't, and suffering, and they would cover them with gloss and strings as though they were. He tried to hide the reality because he was sick of acting and sick of being. He was about to give it all up after being informed who to be. But a shift small at first, there was a fresh energy coming up from Texas, like a distant thunderclap. A bizarre and lovely confluence of drifters, hippies, bikers, and cowboys in Austin, all congregating to listen to authentic music in smoke-filled taverns and outdoor spaces. Once more, it was a little raw poetry and not just country or rock. People would eventually refer to this psychedelic phenomenon as cosmic cowboy, but it was more than just a genre, a movement that was urging Willie Nelson to return home, and it was supported by Willie. Packed up and left Nashville, no more suits, no more buddies like Kris, and tired of compromising. With phony grins, he traveled to Austin and entered a replica of He Wasn't a Struggling Songwriter. He was the one who had been waiting in Texas all along. He was a guitar-wielding prophet, and venues like Armadillo World Headquarters embraced him. It was an ordinary country club. One night you would hear jazz, the next Willie and night outlaw country, the following acid rock, fitting perfectly. He played barefoot, his hair growing wild, and he literally and musically lit up the stage. These weren't fans searching for radio singles, but the crowds couldn't get enough of them. We're searching for soul-satisfying truth, and Willie provided it in each note. Nashville never permitted this flexibility, and as his voice changed, so did his influence. All of a sudden, he was leading a rebellion rather than merely playing. Willie in country, a new rival to music, rose polished, formulaic sound. Its heart belonged to Nelson, but Kristofferson kept burning his. Although the door may have been kicked open by the helicopter stunt on his own path, it was his songs about loneliness, sorrow, and other themes that put him in the spotlight. Redemption that sliced like a razor through Nashville's glitz and into their. Kris and Willie were jogging parallel on opposite roads, both of them making a fresh area that showed that music wasn't bound by anyone's rules. A generation of musicians who believed that being heard didn't require selling your soul. Together they were the outlaws, not merely members of the outlaw movement. Willie subsequently stated, "Texas gave me freedom, Nashville gave me suits," and that independence gave rise to a sound that permanently altered country music. By the middle of the 1970s, Kristofferson had a polished, imperfect, yet genuine, and pure become the most unusual superstar in country music history. And he wasn't merely no longer a songwriter, he represented a cultural change while holding Grammys in one hand. With screenplays for movies in the other, he was enjoying a surge of praise from critics that few musicians, much less country singers, receive. Has had the opportunity to perform his poems on the big screen, appearing in movies such as alongside Barbra Streisand and Strolling the Red Carpet, A Star is Born. Had never seen a man with a Harvard vocabulary and cowboy boots, but he was charismatic. Critics referred to him as the thinking man's outlaw because he was intelligent, tough, and outspoken. was a rebellious country music artist who could quote Shakespeare, a rugged beauty who wrote about suffering in a variety of ways. Hollywood loved him, and the media followed him because it sounded like gospel. Once doubtful, the industry now viewed him as royalty, and he was not far behind him on a Willie Nelson took a very different route when Chris was winning honors and Willie continued to grind through smoke-filled taverns and county fairs wearing tuxedos. He wasn't photogenic in the conventional sense, so Nashville had written him off long ago. Executives who believed that polish, not personality, was the key to radio success were still perplexed by his sensibility and voice. There was something about Willie that couldn't be contained. Shotgun Willie was more than simply another record in 1973. He was a Willie left the final traces of his statement a line in the sand with his record. The Nashville pattern, he leaned, let his beard grow wild, and grew his hair long. Gone were the outlaw personas that had always been within of him. Stripped-down guitars took the place of the string arrangements and fitted suits. Grit and unapologetic lyrics, Shotgun Willie didn't merely unveil a new sound that featured the real Willie, and fans gradually became aware of it, but Willie's reputation eventually began to rise, not thanks to industry contributions but rather word of mouth, enthusiasm during live performances, and tunes that sounded like by the late 70s, they had been dragged from a dusty bar stool at 2 a.m. Was packing stadiums as well as clubs, which is ironic. Nashville attempted to silence had evolved into the voice of a generation that was yet hidden beneath the surface of these two sharp ascents were the result of a subtle tension that was not based on animosity but rather on when Christopher initially gained attention, he was hailed as a genius, a Renaissance man. And the future of he deserved it in many ways since his remarks had opened doors in the country music industry. And his audacity had sparked a fresh surge of genuineness. But Willie had been waiting in the wings are writing hits for other players who are observing and following someone else's rules. Moment Chris turned into the poster, emerging from the shadows as doors were shut in his face. You couldn't blame Willie for wondering, when is it? As a youngster of the new era of the country. It's my turn? Although some referred to it as rivalry, it was more nuanced than that, and Willie wasn't. He was irritated by a system that had disregarded him for decades and was envious of Chris's prominence. Willie, who is regarded as the savior of country music, had to endure the scars to struggle for recognition. Demonstrate that both guys were crucial, with Christopher making the initial breakthrough. Making the world realize that country music may be literary and philosophical even by using poetry as a weapon revolutionary. But Willie had a deeper impact than Chris. Willie captured the soul, even if one writer once remarked, Chris made people believe that Willie made them feel. By 1980, the roles had begun to shift in the opposite direction. Willie Nelson was now the most well-known figure in country music, selling millions of records while on tour. He had transcended what it meant to be a star, not by making concessions but by reaffirming his identity. His genuineness turned into his strength. Kristofferson's star, meanwhile, was fading a little but was still highly regarded. Revered, but the Golden Boy was no longer the center of attention. Instead, rivalry, if there was resentment, it was buried, but if there was envy, it was silent. What was left was a peculiarly lovely tension between two guys who had transformed an industry and achieved it according to their own terms. Although one had traveled a longer distance, both had ultimately arrived earlier. Rita Coolidge had already captured the attention of almost everyone. When I first saw her, she wasn't only gorgeous, she had a voice as smooth and smoky as midnight. Even when she wasn't singing, she was captivating and full of stories. Of a woman who attracted attention naturally yet was an artist beneath the glitz, equally profound and serious as any of the men she collaborated with during the early. She had previously worked with legendary artists Eric Clapton, Joe Cocker, and Leon in the 1970s. Russell was forging her own path, She wasn't someone who wrote coattails through the center of American music, and two outlaws came across it somewhere. Icons were ensnared in her sphere even before Rita became Mrs. There were rumors circulating in the industry that she and Willie Nelson had had a private, possibly brief conversation. There were no love letters or tabloid pictures, and romance was never verified. Published, but those present recall the looks, the lengthy discussions, and the sense that something had briefly existed between them, but it was genuine enough to leave an impression. After Chris arrived, their friendship became unavoidably intense. Like magnets, lovely shattered hearts are drawn to one another and are equally prone to the world. Witnessed the golden pair when they were married in 1973. Chris, it was pandemonium behind the scenes despite the rebel poet and the beautiful songbird. Despite his genius, he had demons that he couldn't always overcome because of his emotions. Noisy and erratic, and the stress of celebrity just made him worse. Loved Rita a lot, sometimes too much, and his love was frequently entangled with Rita loved him too, but she was afraid of losing him because of envy, uncertainty, and anxiety. Was passionately independent, strong, and creative, and she didn't want to be someone's property, regardless of how well known or ardent he was. According to the allegations, Willie had a particular place in her heart before in the world they lived in. Whether life was true or not hardly mattered. For a man like Christofferson, perception was powerful, and that unwritten history, even if it wasn't just one night, it might seem like Rita was betrayed. Chris leaving a gathering without saying anything when Willie and he were laughing, the tension between them lingered in the air like a song that nobody wanted to finish. Rita, without having to be expressed out, remarked, "It was love, but it was war." Their marriage was a fire that burnt quickly. There were beautiful moments, late-night confessions, and innovative music sharing. Highs, but there were also erratic mistrust and a feeling that something was constantly on the edge of shattering. But Willie stayed away. He'd witnessed enough love to understand how chaotic it can become. His own past was replete with heartache, betrayal, and a trail of failed relationships and marriages. Yet he never disparaged Chris or Rita. If he had feelings for her, he kept them to himself out of respect and loyalty. Years later, when questioned about his previous romances, he revealed a lesson he had learned the hard way. Simply put, Willie stated, "I never held a grudge over love." Perhaps that was the distinction between them, is that Willie loved with patience, whereas Chris loved with fury. Rita had transformed them both in their own ways, and ultimately the storm of by 1980, Chris and Rita's marriage had failed due to their intense desire. Having given in to fatigue, Rita left with sorrow and admiration for Chris. The man she married would later refer to losing her as one of his worst errors made by Willie in that narrative. Whether as a former, it's still unclear whether it's a flame or only a faint background presence. But even the shadow of that triangle, according to those close to the trio decades later, never completely vanished. It left a lasting impression but did not end their friendship. Scar, and scars are only a part of the narrative in the outlaw country realm. In the 1980s, Willie Nelson and Chris Christofferson had entered a new phase of their life marked by intense personal hardships. Amid public disputes that posed a harm to their artistic heritage, for the demons that had been lurking in the background, Chris eventually surfaced. Alcoholism started to take over once the wild years of celebrity had taken their toll. Undermined his relationships and career, the guy who previously confidently controlled the stage suddenly found himself. His personal struggles have damaged his reputation, and the songs that made him a legend became more difficult to achieve, and his career started to decline. Chris had to face the reality that his lights, which had once shone so brightly, now appeared to flicker. His own vices could destroy everything he's created, but in another area of Willie Nelson's world in the country music industry was collapsing, but this time it wasn't through personal issues, but there was a huge financial scandal that may ruin everything he had worked for at Willie's. The IRS was the issue, not drugs, drink, or love. Following years of mismanaging his finances and putting his trust in the wrong people, Willie was nearly bankrupted by a tax bill, and the government smacked him with an enormous debt of $16.7 million. Claiming that he had unpaid taxes due to investments he made in illicit tax havens established by it was a financial catastrophe for his Price Waterhouse accountants that threatened to ruin his livelihood and career. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same Willie who had fought for liberty disobeyed the law and rejected the establishment, and was now being targeted by the same system that he had fought for decades. Yet where others would have fallen under the weight of the financial blow he delivered, Willie, as usual, took it in stride. Willie Nelson was able to transform it into song with the assistance of who purchased the IRS tapes, an album that his daughter Lana Willie recorded? According to my recollections, the CD was as honest and unvarnished as the man himself. It was a lifeline, not simply a record. Willie transformed his debt into and the album was sold late at night, giving his admirers a chance to support him. Infomercials are an odd yet clever method of spreading the message, raising money, and fans reacted by purchasing the CD in large quantities, which helped Willie settle his debt with the same devotion and affection they had always shown him. But while he was battling the IRS, Willie's personal life was no less convoluted, and he was well known for his relationships with women. Had a history of adultery with his second wife and had been married several times. In the most unexpected way, Shirley Colley learned about one of his most notorious affairs. She might have gotten a hospital bill for giving birth to a child that wasn't hers. Willie had been having undue relations with Connie Kupka, and the Paula Carlin Nelson, the daughter of the affair, was born. Willie's marriage to Shirley terminated almost instantly once the news hit her like a freight train. This was simply when his personal life was as chaotic and complicated as a chapter in